This is St. Louis on the Air from St. Louis Public Radio. I'm Elaine Cha. Almost 2 months have passed since Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th, and the war continues to rage. Israeli forces have killed thousands of civilians in Gaza, while Hamas continues to hold more than 100 Israeli hostages. There was a ceasefire last month, which sparked some hope and led to dozens of hostages being released. But that relative calm lasted only a matter of days. After a week's truce, war resumed. The conflict is bigger than just events in Israel. In these 2 months, we've seen protesters in St. Louis take to the streets in support of Israelis and Palestinians. At the end of October, we heard from a St. Louis University graduate student who shared how she is experiencing the war via updates from her family living in Gaza. And today, our focus is on how St. Louis's Jewish community experiences this war. We'll hear from 2 local women who, both in their own ways, see Israel as a deeply important part of their heritage and Jewish identity, and who feel the ongoing war is simultaneously very far away and too close to home. Let's begin with Galit Lev-Harir, who lived in Israel for years before moving to St. Louis in the 1990s. She was in Israel on October 7th and witnessed the aftermath of the violence there. Producer Danny Wysentowski sat down with Galit last month. I should note here that this interview took place November 21st, 3 days before Israel and Hamas agreed to a ceasefire and the release of some of the hostages. Danny began by asking Galit to describe what she saw in Israel on October 7th.
We try to visit about every year. And this year we went for a friend's daughter's wedding and to spend the Jewish holidays with my husband's family. So the morning of October 7th was a Jewish holiday. It's called Simchat Torah. And the evening beforehand, we had a dinner with everyone in his family. And his nephew, who was serving in the army as a combat medic, received leave to come home and spend the holiday with us. So he was with us as well. We were at synagogue, and my husband's brother and his son never showed up at the synagogue. So my husband went over to their house to see what was going on and why they weren't there. And he saw that our nephew was getting ready to go back to the army. And he was puzzled. He asked why, what had happened. And his nephew explained that morning at 6:30 in the morning, the base where my nephew's unit was stationed had been overrun by terrorists. And all of his friends who were at the base at the time, he had 18 friends who were at the base, and they were all killed. And the way my nephew found this out was because the terrorists filmed the dead bodies. And so my nephew looked at his phone and he saw all of these images of 18 of his friends who had been murdered.
Tell us a bit about your nephew, Ron.
Yes, his name is Ron. He just turned 21 on November 16th. And he was actually a week away from finishing his army service. Army service is mandatory in Israel. Young men serve 2 years and 8 months. Women serve 2 years. Ron volunteered to be one of the people to go in and help evacuate the wounded. And he was in a combat vehicle with 3 other soldiers plus a driver. They were headed into the community to evacuate the wounded, and their vehicle was hit by an anti-tank missile. The anti-tank missile grazed the right side of his body and hit the soldier sitting opposite him. The other soldier was killed instantly, and Ron was thrown out of the vehicle. The vehicle kept moving because they were under heavy fire, and the other soldiers who were in the vehicle were sure that Ron had been killed. They brought him back to the triage area. Eventually, they were able to bring in a helicopter to airlift him to a nearby hospital. And when he got to the hospital, a team worked on him and they notified his parents. And then we went to the hospital, and I was there for about a week initially after the attack took place and after he lost his arm.
You mentioned that his birthday
Yes.
was just a few days ago. I looked at his Facebook page, and you can see, if you scroll down, you can see a picture of him in his uniform, and you scroll up, and he's in a hospital bed, and he's missing an arm, and he's smiling, and he's giving a thumbs up, and he's talking about his birthday. How is he doing?
He is an incredible young man. He always has been. And the first 5 days after he was wounded, he was sedated and intubated. And when they brought him out of the sedation, he was a little groggy from all the drugs. He wasn't sure where he was. And so his father went in to talk with him and help him understand that his arm was gone, because he didn't realize that either. And his response was, "Oh, am I going to get a bionic arm? Well, that's going to help me get girls."
Oh, my gosh.
So he has an amazing sense of humor.
21 is 21.
21 is 21. Absolutely. Yes.
You returned to America 10 days after the attack. What did
Yes.
that feel like to you, to return to this country that was also reckoning with what had just happened?
Honestly, it was very difficult for me emotionally after I returned to the United States, because everyone, such as my work colleagues and my friends, were just going about their daily life as though nothing had happened. And I was so upset and distraught is the correct word, about what was going on in Israel and about the hostages, and imagining what those hostages must be going through, especially the children. There are over 32 children still being held by Hamas. And I found it difficult to work and to go about my regular daily life, because I was so upset about what was going on in Israel. And the fact that people around me didn't understand why I was so upset, that made it difficult for me.
You also, not just Roan, but you actually knew someone else who lost their life in the October 7th attack, and that involved that music festival
Correct.
that was overrun and a massacre that took place there. Tell us about that.
So her name was Galit Lev-Harir, and she was a wonderful young woman. A few years ago, she came here to St. Louis to volunteer for a summer. She worked at the summer camp that one of my sons attended. We hosted her at our house for a week, and many of our friends here in St. Louis also had the opportunity to host her. And she was just a beautiful young woman, full of life. And she went to the music festival to party and have a good time. I mean, it was just that kind of festival. Nobody could have ever imagined that such an attack would have taken place.
There is an Israeli-American community, I understand, who have family in the Israeli army, who have family in Israel. What is the community here in St. Louis like among Israelis? What do you talk about? How do you support each other?
So there is a small Israeli-American community here in St. Louis. We are very connected with one another. And since October 7th, it has been reassuring to be together with other people who understand what we're going through and who are going through the same thing. And you don't have to explain why you're upset, why you're distraught, because they're all feeling the same thing. There is also a very large Jewish community here in St. Louis. I think the Jewish community in St. Louis is about 60,000 people. There are about a dozen synagogues, and the vast majority of the Jewish community has been very supportive of Israel. We have had several rallies to express our hope that the hostages will be returned to their families, and also to protest the rampant anti-Semitism that we see going on in America right now.
We're listening to a conversation with Galit Lev-Harir, a St. Louis resident who was in Israel during the attack by Hamas on October 7th. Galit spoke to producer Danny Wysentowski about her experiences in the aftermath of that attack and how St. Louis's Jewish community is responding to the war. Let's return to that conversation.
You're wearing a blue ribbon today.
I am.
Tell me about that. Why is that?
The blue ribbon is to remember the hostages, and there's a campaign to continue to wear the blue ribbons until all of the hostages are returned to their families.
You know, as we're speaking right now, news is developing that there may be a ceasefire, of a number of days. There may be hostages exchanged as part of that deal. How are you feeling watching this with all of the tensions that go into what might come of this? Will they be okay? What will be the next steps?
So I am very concerned when I hear that there may be a ceasefire. There was a ceasefire in place on October 6th, and Hamas broke that. So I'm very concerned about the idea of a ceasefire because it seems to be one-sided. Personally, I would like to see the children released because it is just unfathomable to me. There's a 10-month-old baby. There are children 3, 4, 5 years old who are being held as hostages without their parents. Who's taking care of those children?
I wanted maybe to take a step back from just October 7th, and I think your own experience with Israel and your connection. You moved there in the 80s, spent a good number of years there, returned, then you eventually moved to St. Louis, but you spend a great amount of time, and that is not uncommon.
So I moved to Israel in the 80s, shortly before the whole Oslo process, and it was a period where we were really hopeful that there was going to be a true and lasting peace. I actually worked for an organization called Interns for Peace, which made meetings between Jews and Palestinians. I visited the West Bank on numerous occasions. I visited Gaza once. We brought notebooks and crayons and milk and other things to Palestinian children in the West Bank. It was a pro-peace organization, and we had many relationships, particularly with women's groups between Palestinian women and Jewish women who both wanted peace. And it felt like a time when there was going to be peace. There was the Oslo Agreement, which Bill Clinton supported that agreement between Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat. So we thought there was going to be peace.
A lot of people look back in that era, the death of Rabin, Yasser Arafat's rejection of that peace plan, the terrorist attacks that kind of continued as the end of that hope for that peace process,
yes,
or the end of that particular effort. Do you still have that hope, and do you see it somewhere?
I am more pessimistic today because back then there were a lot of organizations that were doing the kind of work that I was doing, that were creating meetings between Palestinians and Jews and trying to work together and promoting peace. And today I see more extremism on both sides. Obviously, I can only speak for myself. I can't speak on behalf of others. But there is a huge concern of what is going to happen after this war ends. And so the question is, what can we do in the future to prevent such attacks? And how can it be done in a way that isn't going to increase the suffering of the Palestinian people? Because there's no question that the Palestinian regular civilians are suffering. So how do you protect Israeli civilians without creating a situation that is untenable for Palestinian civilians. And there is no easy answer.
You spend a lot of time in Israel. You go there every year.
Yes.
You see your family, your kids who are studying there. Do you plan on going back?
Well, our home is in St. Louis. We really love St. Louis. We've lived here for 24 years. We've raised our kids here, and this is the place I consider our home. However, Israel will always be in our hearts, and all of our family is there. We hope to be able to continue to go back every year to visit and to spend time with family.
If you had to imagine what Israel would be like maybe next time you're there, maybe in a year time, what are your hopes in that vision? What does the country look like to you?
My hope is that the communities in southern Israel that were destroyed during this attack will be rebuilt, that people will be safe to go back there and live there. My hope is that somehow or another we will find a way to prevent an attack of this magnitude from ever reoccurring. And I don't know how that can be achieved, but that's my hope.
That was Galit Lev-Harir, a St. Louis resident who was in Israel on October 7th, the day that Hamas attacked Israel. She spoke with St. Louis on the Air producer Danny Wysentowski on November 21st. Days later, a ceasefire led to the release of more than 100 Israeli hostages. The ceasefire ended just 1 week later. The Washington Post reports that more than 100 hostages remain in Gaza. Coming up, we'll continue our look into what St. Louis's Jewish community members are experiencing at this time of war in Israel, and hear from someone who is asking her community to do more in calling for a ceasefire. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
Welcome back. Today we're talking with members of St. Louis's Jewish community about the war in Israel and Gaza. Earlier in our show, we heard one local woman's experience in Israel on October 7th when Hamas attacked Israel, killing more than 1,200 people and kidnapping hundreds more. A great deal has happened since October 7th. Israeli ground and air forces have killed thousands of civilians in Gaza. The events of that day became the start of another war, one that's continued with a brief week-long ceasefire to this moment. As we've noted on this program, no one story can capture all perspectives. And as elsewhere around the country and the world, some communities of Jewish people in St. Louis have rallied in support of Israel. At the same time, local Jewish people are visible, vocal participants in demonstrations supporting Palestinians and demanding a ceasefire. Tasha Kaminsky is the founder of Hineni, a group of Jewish St. Louisans who are speaking out about their support for a ceasefire. And she joins us now. Tasha, welcome to St. Louis on the Air.
Thank you so much for having me.
Tasha, can you talk with me about October 7th? Where were you when you first learned about what was happening that day?
Yeah, I was at home. It was Shabbat, and it was Simchat Torah, which is actually a really happy holiday in Judaism. And so I had not been on social media or reading the news, which is my practice on Shabbat. And my husband alerted me to the fact that there had been a terrible terrorist attack in Israel, which is what we always are concerned about when we come back to our phones and come back to the real world after observing Shabbat.
Mm-hmm. And that's every week then?
Yes, that's every week.
And how was it that, given the holiday, that the news affected you?
I was shocked because I had been thinking about Simchat Torah's festivities. I had been enjoying my Shabbat, and I recognized that that is a specific time in Israel when people would be especially caught off guard.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of those in Israel, I mean, did you know people either directly or personally who were there?
So, while I did not know anyone personally who was at the music festival or on these kibbutzim that were attacked, my family was good friends with Vivian Silver, who was initially believed to have been taken as a hostage, but recently it was determined that she passed away on October 7th in a terrorist attack on her kibbutz.
Mm-hmm. What was it like to receive that news?
Completely devastating. From all accounts, Vivian was a very valorous woman. She co-founded Women Wage Peace, a movement between Palestinians and Israelis for peace. She sat on the board for B'Tselem, which is the leading human rights organization in Israel. And I know that she meant a great deal to my cousin Sarah.
Mm-hmm. How did members of the Jewish community around you respond to the news?
There was so much shock and grief and pain. It's really difficult when something especially of that scale occurs in Israel for the Jewish community to not be immediately affected. Either you personally know someone or you know someone who knows someone. And so in the aftermath, in the days immediately afterwards, there was an outpouring of deep grief, deep sadness, and the stories just kept coming about how violent and horrible the attacks had been and how young so many of the people who died were. Mm-hmm. And that was particularly awful for so many of us here in St. Louis and across the country.
So, Tasha, you founded a group after October 7th called Hineni. Why is it that you decided to do that?
I saw in the aftermath of October 7th that there would be another military response to what had occurred. This is an ongoing pattern. And I knew that it was very likely this military response would escalate and escalate. And I saw that there was a silence that needed to be filled, and that there were Jewish people looking to fill that silence. So I wanted to make a resource for them to find one another and to gather together and to advocate in a Jewish way for a ceasefire.
Mm-hmm. And Hineni, what does that mean, and what does it reflect about what the group does?
Hineni is Hebrew for here I am. Often when you read the text of the Torah or of our prophets, when a prophet is called, like Moses, God will say, "Where are you?" And the prophet will respond, "Here I am." And I wanted to offer that message to other Jews. Here we are. You're looking for us, and we're ready to find you.
Mm-hmm. So your group has advocated for a ceasefire. What exactly does that mean, Tasha?
A ceasefire for Hineni means both sides, Israel and Hamas, lay down their weapons. A ceasefire means no more killing, no more dying. A ceasefire means all hostages come home.
You're also a member of a coalition called If Not Now. How is that group either different from or similar to Hineni?
They're very similar groups. If Not Now has been doing incredible work for a long time, many, many years now. They are a national movement of Jews in America who want to see freedom, peace, safety, dignity, and justice for all people living in Israel and Palestine.
One of the things that has been happening is that people have been gathering together. There was a ceasefire Sabbath in November, and on December 3rd, a holding space event.
So ceasefire Shabbat was a unique experience. It was explicitly Jewish. We came together to celebrate Shabbat in a traditional fashion. We prayed in Hebrew. We had challah, we made kiddush over the wine, and we shared a meal together with our neighbors, both Palestinian and Jewish. And we prayed for peace and for happier days together. The grief space was graciously offered by Matovu, a Jewish community center in St. Louis City. And at both the ceasefire Shabbat, where nearly 50 people attended, and the grief space where approximately 30 people attended, it was clear that there were Jewish people in St. Louis in deep despair and pain. Their grief over the loss of life is overwhelming to them, and they're seeking out what they know to be a safe place for them, which is a Jewish space. And I'm grateful that these Jewish spaces have been created for Jews who do want a ceasefire to come together and be in community. Because if it's one Jewish value that most of us know, it's that it's not good for us to be alone.
We need to take a quick break here, but when we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Tasha Kaminsky. This is St. Louis on the Air on St. Louis Public Radio.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association, committed to conservation and careful management of the state's forests to make them more resilient and better habitats for wildlife. ChooseWood.com.
Welcome back. Before the break, Tasha, you were talking about the importance of having a Jewish safe space. What is it that you are hearing from those who are coming to these gatherings? And what is it that they're wrestling with most at this moment?
Some of the things that I'm hearing from fellow Jews who come to these spaces looking for community that supports a ceasefire is that they feel very lonely. It's an incredibly lonely time to be Jewish. And I understand why that is. There are so many things happening in Israel and in Gaza that are horrific. And it touches us deeply, and it moves our sensibilities. And so many of us find comfort in our faith. And to be able to find Jewish community at a time like this is essential for our wellness and for our ability to continue on doing the work that we do. I'm encountering people who are afraid of the rise of anti-Semitism. I'm encountering people who fear for the safety of their Palestinian neighbors. I'm encountering people who worry that their desire for a ceasefire seems divisive in their community, which isn't what they want to be. They want so desperately to be with their Jewish community right now. And so I think it's really important that we continue to create spaces that are Jewish, that also hold space and room for a variety of points of view, including wanting a ceasefire.
Mm-hmm. The Hineni group posted something to Instagram that I'd like to ask you about, and it reads, "It's okay to want a ceasefire if you are Jewish. It's okay to want to see a safe return of the hostages. You do not have to choose between your Judaism and Palestinian liberation. What is it that you were trying to address with that?
Yeah, I actually looked back at that post and I read the words that came after that message, and I realized what I was trying to say was that you're not alone. If you want a ceasefire and you're Jewish, there are other Jews right here in St. Louis who want the same thing as you. And that's an okay thing to want. And it's a very Jewish thing to want. And I just wanted to be sure that if there was anyone out there who felt alone, that they knew there were other people they could talk to, and that they weren't alone, and they could still be Jewish and still honor their Jewish heritage and identity while advocating for a ceasefire.
Tasha, I'd like you to talk with us a bit about your connection to Israel. You are not Israeli, but what happens there matters to you. Why is that the case?
While I am not Israeli, both my maternal and paternal family live in Israel. My family has been in Israel since before Israel was ever a state. And I care about my family deeply, as most people do. I love them. I want them to be safe. I want my friends who I went to graduate school, who are Israeli citizens and have children of their own now, to be safe. I've lost people to terrorism. I've lost professors to terrorism in Israel. And it is my most ardent hope that someday I will get to see peace in my lifetime. It matters to me because their lives matter to me. Their well-being matters to me. And it matters to me because I am Jewish, and I do believe that Jerusalem is a holy city.
And you lived for a couple months in Israel in 2014. And at that time, Israel was waging another military operation against Hamas in Gaza. What was that experience like for you? And do these two wars feel in any way similar?
The experience of being in Israel in 2014 was eye-opening. When I was in Israel, I was there during the summer, and during my time there, I was visiting with family and friends, and I had several near misses as tensions escalated. I had started in Jerusalem with my cousin and gotten off a tram that goes through the city, and shortly after I got off the tram, a bomb went off on the tram that I had been on. And my cousin recommended that I go to Tel Aviv. And then I went on to Ashdod, which is a coastal city near Gaza. And that was when the war really escalated. A Palestinian boy had been burned alive, and 2 Jewish boys had been kidnapped and murdered. And so Israel had launched something called My Brother's Keeper, which was an incursion into Gaza. When you're in Ashdod and there's fighting, the rockets fire that happens, which comes from Gaza into Israel, is constant. I lived in a bomb shelter for several weeks with my family, and I am familiar with how untenable and difficult and painful and scary it is to live in a war zone. This particular military incursion feels very different than Brother's Keeper. The loss of life has transcended any war that I'm familiar with in my own personal lifetime. And the loss of life in Israel has also transcended any number that I am familiar with in my lifetime.
So there's no comparison, really.
I think that it is a pattern, but it's not necessarily comparable, no.
Last month, Tasha, you sent out a press release asking rabbis and Jewish leaders to support a ceasefire, with both sides putting a halt to fighting and the hostages coming home. You also signed a public letter addressed to the Jewish organizations that raised us. What is it that you are asking of the Jewish community in this moment?
All that I am asking is to make space and to imagine the possibilities of a ceasefire. There are so many devout Jews who love being Jewish and love being in the Jewish community, and I want to make sure that every single Jewish person who wants to ask for a ceasefire feels it is safe for them to do so.
And as we finish here, October 7th this year, it was a holiday. In the holiday that comes next year, what are your hopes?
In my wildest dreams, I'll get to celebrate Simchat Torah and know that my family in Israel is safe and happy and has seen justice, and I will know that there is peace in Gaza and that Palestinians feel safe and secure and have justice and dignity.
Tasha, thank you for talking with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Tasha Kaminsky is a Jewish community organizer who lives in St. Louis. After October 7th, she started Hineni STL. The group is advocating for a Jewish call for a ceasefire in Israel and Gaza. At St. Louis Public Radio, we understand that no one story will capture the full range of experiences and emotions connected to this decades-long conflict. Our coverage is focused on sharing the direct experiences of people who live here in our region. If you have personal connections to what's happening in Israel, Gaza, or the West Bank, and you want to share your experience, send an email to our talk show team. You can reach us at talk@stlpr.org.
This episode was produced by Danny Wissentowski.
Audio engineering and podcast design by Aaron Dorr.
Our executive producer is Alex Hoyer.
St. Louis on the Air is a production of St. Louis Public Radio. Understanding starts here.
St. Louis on the Air proudly supports local artists by using music from Life Creative Group.
Do you find yourself regularly listening to episodes of St. Louis on the Air? Suggest us to a friend you think might enjoy our conversations, and leave us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts on the App Store. It's the simplest way to help people discover our show. Thank you.
St. Louis Public Radio is a member-supported service of the University of Missouri St. Louis.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.